Professor Justin Barrett. Justin is the Thrive Professor of Developmental Science and Professor of Psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary. Previously, he was at Oxford University, where he helped to establish and became the director of the Center for Anthropology of Mind in the Institute for Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology. Justin is an experimental psychologist who has published over 100 articles and book chapters and 3 books and many edited volumes. He is also, it's a pleasure for me to have him here as someone who works in the cognitive and evolutionary sciences of religions. He's one of the founders of the cognitive science of religion. The early work was largely philosophical, and Justin contributed to that, but he also began doing psychological experiments, which really laid the foundation for a field that has thrived in the past 25 years. So please join me in welcoming Professor Justin Barrett.
Thanks. What I'd like to do is try to weave together some of the themes, some of the findings you've heard from other presentations, if you've been with us this weekend, in a little bit of a broader framework to discuss why is it that ideas about ghosts, spirits, formerly human spirits and so forth are so common, widespread, natural, but then also point forward for the students here who are looking for their, thesis projects and so forth, what are some sort of open research questions that could be kind of fun to explore, particularly around why is it, if these kinds of beliefs are so common, that they seem to have oftentimes kind of marginal place in formalized religion or theological traditions. At least that's what it looks like. I want to start with just sort of explaining in a pithy kind of way, what is this cognitive science of religion thing that you just heard mentioned? And what's the general approach to the study of cultural materials, cultural expression, like ghost beliefs, for instance? Well, cognitive science of religion is an area of scientific inquiry that tries to account for cultural phenomena like ghosts, gods' beliefs, ideas about souls and so forth, the practice of rituals, by appealing to how human minds naturally work. The assumption behind this is that, look, human minds actually have properties that make them really good at thinking some kinds of thoughts as opposed to others. That is, we're not just sort of general, all-purpose, infinitely flexible sort of information processors. We are specialized processors for the kinds of niches in which humans have evolved and developed, okay? So that makes some ideas easier, better to think than others. That also suggests that some ideas are easier for us to transmit, to communicate to each other than others. Right? If an idea is easier to think, it's also easier for me to trigger that thought in you through some kind of communicative act, whether it's verbal or not. That fact then creates kind of you might think of it as a funnel or a pipeline or something like that, that makes some ideas more likely to be transmitted than others. And if ideas are more likely to be transmitted than others, they're more likely also to stabilize in populations, to spread successfully, and so on, and become something that we would call cultural, not just idiosyncratic, not just my idea, but ideas that we can share as a group. Okay? But then the trick for cognitive science of religion then is to identify what look to be cross-culturally recurrent forms of human expression, and then kind of look downstairs into human cognition or other psychological dynamics to try to figure out, well, what make those particular forms of expression so catchy? Or as Deb Kellerman used the metaphor of fertile ground on which these ideas could grow. I like to use the metaphor of conceptual spaces. Are you familiar with this sort of preschool toy that's a shape sorter? It's kind of a roundish thing, and it's got different gaps that you sort of slide there's a round one, and you squeeze that through the hole, or there's a square one. Some of you are nodding. Some of you need to play with more children. This is a good time. Or maybe, I don't know, undergrads might still enjoy this. I don't know. Especially after yesterday. This might be what they can manage. But the idea is that our minds, by virtue of just being human beings, the kind of animal we are, growing up in typical human environments, not exceptional ones, give us sort of characteristic little shapes or conceptual spaces that then get filled by cultural input. And it doesn't really matter what the color of the shape is, the cultural particular. What matters is it fits the conceptual space. My suggestion is that by virtue of the kind of minds we naturally have, we've got kind of a conceptual space that easily accommodates these sort of ghost or afterlife beliefs. And that's part of an account for why it is that ghosts, these formerly human spirits, ancestors, are everywhere. And they are, let me make that perfectly clear, they're everywhere. People all over the world believe in these things, claim to witness these things. We saw the data yesterday that, roughly 73% of Americans, roughly 70% of Kiwis believe in ghosts. But if you go to other parts of the world, it's not if, it's when. So if you go to a country like Indonesia, everybody knows that there are spirits and ghosts around. If you haven't seen them, there's something wrong with you. So the idea for especially a lot of, educated, sort of scientifically sophisticated Western folks to think, wow, it's really weird that some people believe in ghosts. The rest of the world is thinking you're weird, okay? It's really easy to get sort of ethnocentric about this, but that is the fact of the matter. They think there's something wrong. You've somehow pushed all of the ghosts off the islands or whatever it is, or, chased them out of or you're just, I don't know, what are you drinking? That coffee stuff is sort of confusing your brain and you don't see them, and they're all over the place. Okay, they're really widespread. Why are they widespread? Why are these ideas so easy? Well, you've heard some talk about this. One of the ideas is intuitive dualism. That's a notion that Paul Bloom has made famous, but there are other researchers, including Jesse Bering, who've contributed to this literature. And the basic idea here is that humans have a natural kind of cognitive mechanism for handling physical bodies. In fact, it's probably a mechanism we share with other primates. It helps us understand the brute properties of things like this and this and this. And it has a different developmental trajectory and a different evolutionary history than the mechanism that deals with what's going on in my head, my thoughts, my beliefs, my desires, my aims, my goals, my personality. That device develops separately. It has different input conditions. It delivers different outputs. It's a developmental achievement, and a sort of a tenuous one at that, to bring these two together, to think of a human being as both a physical object and a mental being. And that's not the only sort of cognitive mechanism that matters here. We've heard mention of essences and essentialist kind of thinking. It may be that humans are also essentialized to individuate each other. That is, we have this intuition that there's some unseen something in me that makes me me, that preserves my identity over time, over physical changes, that was there when I was this big and is now there when I'm this big. But it's still me somehow, even though the physical body looks entirely different. Okay, that's called essentialism. Pascal Boyer has referred to something he calls a person file. This is sort of an information bank you can think of that gets built up over time when I have interactions with particular people and I get to know them very well. I get to know their personality, their dispositions, what they like, what they don't like, how they tend to behave, how they tend to move. All kinds of different sort of features about them get stored away in my memory. And his contention is that person file doesn't have a natural off switch when a body dies. It continues generating inferences. So we can reasonably go to a funeral and wonder if the deceased likes what's going on here, even if we don't think they're alive, because that person file is still churning on, okay? The fact that we don't necessarily see ghosts in the normal way that we see each other is not a problem for these systems that are dealing with essences or minds. I think some of the most convincing evidence of this comes from the work of Marjorie Taylor and her work on invisible friends. She's documented that it looks like most kids, by the time they're 6 years old, the majority have had invisible friends. We don't actually know just how many have. It's a little bit hard to measure, but surely it's at least 50%, maybe 60% of kids have had invisible friends. These aren't weird kids. And in fact, there's some reason to think they're the ones who grow up sort of with healthy, normal kinds of social interaction skills. That actually kids with some social pathologies might be more likely to not have invisible friends, okay? And And what's interesting about the invisible friends is it looks like kids generate them themselves without bodies, and they interact with them and reason about their beliefs, desires, preferences, and so forth. Bodies are not necessary for that system, it looks like. Brad Wigger has extended some of this work in some interesting ways, comparing invisible friends to God concepts as well, showing that I actually have some striking similarities. This isn't to say that God is an invisible friend, but that God may be working on some of the same kinds of cognitive mechanisms as our ghosts. All right? Deb Kellerman suggested that we are natural eternalists, I think was the term. Is that right? Natural eternalists? This is not just getting at the idea that there's something different between minds and bodies, but that mind-ish thing might persist beyond biological death, or may have existed before biological life. Okay? If you were here for that talk, that was great. Some of the evidence she pointed to and she mentioned, and you heard mention of, is started a lot of the work in this area started with Jesse Baring's sort of cool studies of, mice getting eaten by crocodiles, and then other kinds of sad stories about people dying instantly, and us asking observers, well, is the person still thinking, feeling, and so forth. These studies have now been done in Florida, where Jesse started doing some of this stuff, Spain, Madagascar, England, and China. And we actually get very similar kinds of responses. That is, that people are pretty confident that death is, these are adults, pretty confident about biological states ending with death, but they're not so sure about mental states like desires, emotions, even some perceptual states are a little bit uncertain there. So their confidence goes down. Interestingly, while there are cultural and contextual kinds of factors that seem to interact with this, the Chinese sample, this was a Huang Zhu study, was fascinating in that their results were, in some ways, almost identical to those of folks from Florida, even though the level of explicit belief that death is the absolute end was much lower. Okay, in Florida, you saw more people saying that, well, I don't know if death's the end or not. In China, they were pretty clear. In this southeastern Chinese industrial city, they were pretty clear, no, death's the end. And yet they looked like Floridians when it came to these kinds of more specific questions. Okay, so it looks like our intuitions run the direction of death continues. As Virginia pointed out, this idea of a clear notion of death, not just being as an optional thing, but something that's sort of inevitable, is a developmental achievement in and of itself. My collaborators, some of my students and I looked at this a bit, asking folks in places like Israel and in Ecuador, children, whether they understood that death was the end, or if people just go on living. We didn't ask the same kinds of questions that Virginia did, but we simply were asking things like, well, will your mom go on living forever and ever, or will she eventually die? 3 to 4.5-year-old Israeli children who were actually precocious in a lot of ways. These are among a battery of kinds of questions. They were not so sure that their friend or mother would die, actually. That age group, only about 50% said that a friend would eventually die. And these are not kids who are unaware of death, especially violent death. These were kids from south of Jerusalem who were familiar with all kinds of air raid sirens and other kinds of things like that. Interestingly, for our purposes here, not only was it the case that these kids, preschool kids, only about half of them recognized that their friend would ever die. A majority of them, around 70%, said that God would never die. So they were actually clearer on God's sort of immortality than they were on their friend's mortality. A similar pattern that we found in Ecuador. Here, kids, only about 22% thought that they themselves would ever die of the same age group. 32% thought a parent or a friend would die. 21% thought a dog would die at some point. So it wasn't even just a human thing. And they were all confident that angels wouldn't die. Not all, but the vast majority. Okay, so it seems that young kids have great difficulty thinking of death as the absolute end, as a biological state. There's lots of reason to think these are just our intuitions, that living forever may be something like a developmental primitive or a default. Okay, then we have experiences that seem to be consistent with those kinds of intuitions. Claire White, had she been here, she would have been able to tell us about the commonness, for instance, of what are often taken to be hallucinations, various sights and sounds that we experience within the days or couple of weeks after someone that we know very well has died. These are not uncommon. And they fit with this sort of intuition that we have that somebody's death is not the absolute end. And so then we have to account for that. And then, of course, those experiences get talked about. They get transmitted, and that helps them sort of take on a life of their own. That's a terrible pun, but there you go. Okay, so they become widespread. Well, if we have all of these kinds of intuitive pushes that create this conceptual space that a ghost or a spirit easily fits into, or the ground is very fertile for planting and growing these ideas about ghosts and spirits, why aren't they quite as central to religious systems as we might think? Why aren't they the part of big world religions and theological systems? Well, I think there are a few reasons, but here I'm speculating, folks. So, speculation, hands, here we go. You know, students looking for projects, write them down, show that this is wrong. You know, that's what we do, is we show that each other are wrong. So one suspicion I have is that ghosts have very localized inferential potential. What's this inferential potential? It's a term that Pascal Boyer has used when he talks about why is it that some kinds of these sort of slightly unusual, counterintuitive kinds of ideas about beings like gods, ghosts, spirits, and so forth, why do they transmit so well? Why are they so interesting to us? One of the reasons he suggests is because they often have great inferential potential, the ability to generate new inferences, to explain things that are otherwise inexplicable, particularly around things that really matter to us. An invisible being can know things that regular visible beings can't, because they could be here right now observing us, or in your secret place observing you. These invisible beings, if they have special power too, they can do things that ordinary beings can't do, okay? This gives them inferential potential. A cosmic creator deity has tremendous inferential potential, can explain things like what Deb Kellerman has shown in a lot of her research, this tendency towards seeing design and purpose in the natural world. Well, a creator deity could bring that sort of thing about. That's inferential potential. But what about a ghost? What about that grad student who unfortunately died in a lab, right? And that then, you know, is freaking people out entering these experiments. For those who know the study, you know what I'm talking about. It happens all the time, grad students, sorry. What about them? Well, their inferential potential usually only pertains to that very local, very specific kind of location. And as such, they don't explain much. They're not worth talking about outside of maybe that haunted house at that end of the street, that corner of the woods. So they don't generate lots of talk, they don't generate lots of inferences. And sure enough, in a recent study that I did with Dan Shaw, a collaborator of mine, looking at 108 superhuman beings from 20 different nations all over the world, but principally in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia, we found that high gods are actually less likely to dwell in a specific location. The so-called lower gods, including ghosts and spirits, often have a particular location where they're seen to act or dwell. In fact, it's about 70% have this very limited location. So they have limited signaling value. As we heard the importance of sort of signaling your group commitment, for instance, through Quentin Atkinson, I believe, referenced some of this signaling kind of research. A good signal can help bond groups together. It tells other people of your commitment, especially if there's a cost involved. But the actions I perform in response to a ghost because they seem to have such a localized kinds of existence and inferential potential, maybe they're really lousy at sort of signaling some kind of group coherence. It doesn't tell me much when I just sort of avoid that part of the woods, or when I go there, I'm going to do a little ritual so that that spirit is sort of is satisfied. So maybe they actually have very poor signaling value, especially then if they are a recently deceased kind of person of my clan line. Well, my commitment to them, even if I'm do my ancestral rituals sort of faithfully, what it signals is that I care about my ancestors. Well, that signals something that's valuable, but it's not quite the thing that bonds people across clan lines, for instance, because I don't care about your ancestors, I care about my ancestors. Just a thought, I don't know. Let's see, I really found it interesting that Joshua brought up the evilness and sort of the morally dubious character of a lot of these localized kind of deities as well, or superhuman beings. We found this too in our survey. It tends to be the ones that are kind of evil, evil gods that tend to be very local. And then that makes them very hard sort of moral policing agents, because evil policing agents are really bad moral exemplars. So they're less likely to be really good, judicious sorts of deliverers of rewards and punishments. And so I suspect they're harder to fit into a fear of supernatural punishment kind of theory that Azim was telling us about, for instance. Okay, so then when we do see supernatural agents of this sort, these ghosts and spirits, coming into these bigger religious systems, often they seem like they have to suffer some kind of distortion or change in order to generate the kinds of signaling, the kind of moral sort of supervision and push, generate the kind of inferences that make them worthy of these sort of bigger transgroup kinds of religions that spread and sustain. What do I have in mind there? Often ghosts get turned into ancestors. And we sometimes think ancestors are just ghosts, but in a lot of places they become kind of a collective. They're not individuated anymore. They're more like the Borg, if we're going to use a Star Trek kind of reference. And that's often marked by extra rituals. There's not just the funeral ritual for this person, but they get buried again to become an ancestor. And the ancestors are a de-individuated kind of collective that then has greater power, greater inferential potential, that can then sort of play these more godlike kinds of roles. So that would be another prediction, is that when you do see ghost type things, afterlife beliefs playing these bigger roles, you expect to see ritual markers of them becoming parts of these collectives. So there are a bunch of predictions that I hope some of you will chase down, and maybe some of them are right, some of them will be wrong, no doubt. But my broad point that I want you to take away is that there's all kinds of natural cognition that makes the idea of ghosts, spirits, and so forth very attractive to human minds. For that reason, they're unlikely to go away. They're very common. Returning to China, for the last 70 years, there's been a lot of government and powerful social pressure against belief in ghosts, and these sort of superstitious ideas. And yet, belief in the ancestors and ghosts and spirits is still extremely strong and doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. Thank you very much.